There is a 6-shot pepper-box pistol in a museum case in Salt Lake City, and it was in Joseph Smith's hand when he died. He was standing at the top of a staircase in a limestone jail in Carthage, Illinois, on the 27th of June, 1844, and there was a mob coming up the stairs at him with their faces blacked with wet gunpowder. He fired it into the stairwell. 3 of the 6 barrels misfired. 20 minutes later, he was dead in the dirt on the east side of the building, and his brother Hyrum was dead on the floor above him. And the man everyone in that county had spent 5 years arguing about had stopped being a man and started being a story. If you were with me for part 4, you know how we got here. A printing press destroyed on Mulholland Street on the 10th of June on the mayor's order, and the mayor was Joseph Smith. This is part 5 of 5, and it covers 17 days. So here is what tonight is. I am going to describe a killing in detail, and then I am going to argue against the man who was killed. Properly, using the best version of the case, and not the cartoon. If that sounds like a strange thing to do in a faithful telling, stay with me, because the reason I do it is the whole point of this series, and I'll get to it before the end. One thing first, and I'll be quick. 5 parts is a long way to come with somebody. If you have walked the whole thing with me, the like button is what keeps a channel this small able to make them. That is the entire ask. Back to Carthage. Here's the shape of tonight. 17 days from a broken press to a body. A charge that had nothing to do with the press and could not be bailed. A governor who gave his personal word and then rode out of town. 4 men in an upstairs bedroom, one of them singing. Then a trial the following spring where 5 men stood accused of the murder in front of a jury, and every one of them walked out free. And then the part almost nobody covers, which is what happens to a church whose entire structure ran through one man when that man is suddenly gone. Start with the 17 days, because the sequence matters more than the summary. The press came down on the afternoon of the 10th of June. 2 days later, Thomas Sharp had it in the Warsaw Signal, 20 miles downriver. And what he printed was not an editorial. It was a call. He told his readers that war and extermination were inevitable, and that citizens should arise, one and all. That is the language in a newspaper in an American county in 1844. And it worked, because within days men were organizing in Warsaw and in Carthage and sending to Missouri for help. A warrant came out of Carthage charging Joseph Smith and the members of the city council with riot for destroying the press. And here is where the machinery of Part 4 turns on its owner. The Nauvoo Municipal Court, the same court with the extraordinary habeas corpus power written into the city charter, released them. Then a second arrest and a second release, this time by a friendly justice inside Nauvoo. To a man in Carthage watching this, it looked exactly like what it looked like. A city where the accused ran the court that freed them. So on the 18th of June, Joseph Smith declared martial law in Nauvoo and called out the Legion. Something between 2,000 and 3,000 men under arms in a city that had just refused a county warrant. He put on his uniform and stood on the frame of an unfinished building on Main Street and gave the last public speech of his life to his own army. And whatever he meant by it, he had just handed the state of Illinois the one charge that would keep him in a cell.
Not riot.
Treason against the state of Illinois. A capital charge, and under Illinois law at that time, not bailable. Governor Thomas Ford came down to Carthage on the 21st. Ford was a lawyer, a Democrat, and by his own later admission, out of his depth. He wrote to Joseph Smith that the men had to come to Carthage and stand trial there, in front of the county, or the militias gathering in Hancock County would go get them. And he pledged his personal protection. Now sit with the position that puts a man in. Everyone in Nauvoo, including his own brother, believed Carthage meant death. So on the night of the 22nd, Joseph and Hyrum crossed the Mississippi in a leaking skiff and landed in Iowa, bailing the whole way, intending to go west into the Rocky Mountains and let the storm pass. And then a message came across the river. Some of it was Emma asking him to come back. Some of it was from men in Nauvoo who told him plainly that he was running out on them, that the legion would be slaughtered without him. And there is a report that one of them called him a coward and compared him to a false shepherd who flees when the wolf comes. He turned around. The line attributed to him from that morning, recorded by Willard Richards, is that if his life was of no value to his friends, it was of none to himself. He said he was going like a lamb to the slaughter, and that he was calm as a summer's morning. Whether or not he said those words exactly the way they got written down, understand what the decision was. He had open country in front of him and a river behind him, and he went back. You can read that as a prophet walking into a foreseen death, or as a man out of moves who could not live with the alternative. Both readings are available. The action is the same either way, and the action is the thing the record actually holds. They rode into Carthage in the small hours of the 25th of June, in the rain, past the Carthage Greys, the local militia company, who reportedly cheered and jeered as they went by. They surrendered on the riot charge and were released on bail almost immediately. Then, the same day, the treason charge was sworn out. That's what put them in the jail, not the press, the martial law order. Now I have to introduce you properly to the man whose name should be on this more than anybody's. And it isn't the man who fired the shot. It's Governor Thomas Ford. Ford went to the jail himself on the 26th of June and spent a long stretch of that day in conversation with Joseph Smith. He wrote his own account of it 10 years later in A History of Illinois, published in 1854, and it is a genuinely strange document. Ford describes a man he clearly found impressive and clearly did not believe, and he spends pages explaining, essentially, that the whole affair was the fault of everybody but the governor of Illinois. He also admits, in print, that he had been told the prisoners were in danger, and then on the morning of the 27th, he made the decision the rest of his life was about. He disbanded most of the militia gathered at Carthage. He took an escort and rode to Nauvoo to give a speech, and he left the jail under guard of the Carthage Greys, the one company in that county with the most open hostility to the prisoners, commanded by Robert Smith, who was also the justice of the peace who had signed the order putting them in the jail in the first place. Read that sentence again, because it is not a coincidence anyone has to strain for. The men guarding the prisoners answered to the man who had jailed them. In a town that had spent 3 years reading Thomas Sharp's newspaper. Was Ford in on it? I don't think the evidence supports that, and I'm not going to say it because it makes a better video. What the evidence supports is worse in a quieter way. Ford was a governor who wanted the crisis to be somebody else's, who gave a written personal pledge he had no intention of physically enforcing, and who then arranged the conditions under which a lynching became almost administratively easy, and who spent the following decade writing about how unlucky he had been. He also wrote in that same history a passage predicting that Joseph Smith's name would be remembered when his own was forgotten. And he was right about that one. So look at the building, because I think people picture a dungeon, and it was not one. The Carthage Jail is a 2-story limestone house, and it still stands, and you can walk through it today. The jailer, George Stigall, lived there with his family. There was a criminal cell upstairs with a heavy door, and there was the jailer's own bedroom, a plain room with a window on the east side, and a door with a faulty latch. Stigall moved the prisoners into his bedroom because he thought they would be safer there than in the cell. That decision, made kindly, is the reason the door that mattered on the 27th could not be locked. 4 men were in that room by the afternoon of the 27th. Joseph Smith, Hyrum Smith, who was 44 years old and who had been at his brother's side since 1830 and who could have stayed home. John Taylor, an English convert who would one day lead this church. And Willard Richards, the clerk, a heavy man in a black coat who wrote almost everything we know about that day. Others came and went across those 2 days. Dan Jones, a Welshman, spent the last night on the floor by the door, and Joseph told him quietly in the dark that he would yet see Wales and fill a mission there. Jones did. He went to Wales and baptized thousands, and it is one of the strangest small threads in this whole history. Stephen Markham was run out of town by the Greys. John Fulmer left on an errand and could not get back in. And in the middle of that afternoon, hot, with the flies and the noise of militia in the square, Hyrum asked John Taylor to sing. Taylor sang a hymn called "A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief," which is a long, slow, sad thing about meeting a stranger on the road and not recognizing who he is until the end. When he finished, Hyrum asked him to sing it again. Taylor said he did not feel like singing. Then he sang it again anyway. That is the last ordinary thing that happened in that room. Around 5 o'clock, Ford was 30 miles upriver in Nauvoo, standing in front of the saints, telling them to keep the peace. Between 100 and 200 men came up from the Warsaw Road. Most of them had been in Levi Williams's regiment, disbanded that morning, and they had blacked their faces with wet powder and mud. The guards at the door fired over their heads, which is a detail that tells you what kind of guarding was going on. The mob went up the stairs. The men in the room put their shoulders to the door. A ball came through the panel and struck Hyrum Smith in the face, on the left side of the nose. He fell backward and said, "I am a dead man." And he was. John Taylor tried to beat the gun barrels down with a walking stick, and then went for the window. He was hit 4 or 5 times. One ball struck him in the left thigh and lodged against the bone. Another struck the pocket watch in his vest. Taylor believed for the rest of his life that the watch saved him by stopping a ball fired from outside, and the watch stopped at 16 minutes past 5, which is how we have a time at all. I'll tell you honestly that later examinations of that watch have made some historians think it was broken by the fall against the windowsill rather than by a bullet. I don't know. What I do know is that the man who owned it was hit 4 other times and dragged himself under the bed and lived to become the 3rd president of this church. Joseph Smith had a pistol. Cyrus Wheelock had brought it to him that morning under a raincoat, and Joseph had passed his own single shot to Hyrum earlier. He opened the door a crack and fired the pepper box down the stairwell. 3 barrels went off. 3 misfired. 2 or 3 men in the stairwell were wounded. Then he went to the window. He was hit from behind, from inside the room, and hit again from below, from the yard, and he fell out of the 2nd-story window and about 20 feet to the ground. Witnesses said he cried, "O Lord, my God," as he went. I want to stop on that phrase for 1 second because you will run into an argument about it. Joseph Smith had been initiated as a Freemason in Nauvoo 2 years earlier, and those words are the opening of a Masonic call of distress. Some critics present that as a gotcha, as if a man calling out in the last second of his life is a scandal. Some faithful writers pretend the connection doesn't exist. Both moves are silly. The likeliest reading is the plainest one, which is that a man falling out of a window used the words that were in him, and that they were both a prayer and a call to any brother in that yard who might be bound to answer it. Nobody answered. Willard Richards, standing behind the door in a black coat, was untouched except for a graze on the earlobe. He wrote his account within days, and it is the closest thing we have to a minute-by-minute record. The mob broke and ran on a shout that the Mormons were coming from Nauvoo. Nobody was coming. Carthage emptied that night. Families packed wagons and left, because everyone in that town assumed 12,000 people upriver were about to come and burn it. They did not. And that is the fact I want you to hold, because it is the one that gets skipped in the sensational version of this story. The largest armed body in the state of Illinois had just had its commanding general murdered in state custody, and it did not march. Willard Richards sent a message from Carthage that night, telling the saints to stay home and keep the peace. They stayed home. The bodies came back up the road to Nauvoo on the 28th of June on 2 wagons under branches to keep the sun off. Somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 people filed through the mansion house the next day to see them. And then the family did something that tells you exactly how frightened they were of what came next. They buried 2 coffins, weighted with sandbags in front of everyone, and buried the actual bodies at night in the basement of the unfinished Nauvoo house, and later moved them again. Emma Smith kept that secret, and the graves were not located with any certainty until 1928. Now the trial, because this is the part that almost never gets told, and it is the part that should make everyone uncomfortable. In May of 1845, in the courthouse at Carthage, 5 men went on trial for the murder of Joseph Smith. Thomas Sharp, the newspaper editor who had printed the call to arms; Levi Williams, The colonel whose regiment supplied most of the mob, Mark Aldrich, Jacob Davis, who was a sitting state senator, William Grover. 9 had been indicted. 4 could not be found. The prosecution had witnesses who had been in the yard. The defense strategy was, in effect, that the whole county had done it, and therefore nobody in particular had. On the 30th of May, 1845, the jury acquitted every defendant. Nobody was ever convicted of killing Joseph and Hyrum Smith. If you want the serious study of that trial, it is a book called Carthage Conspiracy, published in 1975 by the University of Illinois Press, written by Dallin Oaks and Marvin Hill. Yes, the same Dallin Oaks whose Utah Law Review study of the Expositor I quoted at length in Part 4. And I bring him up again on purpose. In Part 4, he concluded that the destruction of that press could not be defended as a matter of principle. In this book, he documents in detail how the men who answered that press with murder were let off by a jury that had been selected out from under the prosecution. That is what a careful historian looks like. He does not come out where you expect on either page. And now I owe you the hard argument, so let me build it properly. The case that Joseph Smith died a fallen man, not a martyr, goes like this, and I am going to make it as strong as it can be made. He was in that jail on a treason charge, and the act underlying it was real. He had declared martial law in an American city and called out a private army against a county warrant. He was in that county's crosshairs because he had ordered the destruction of a newspaper that was telling the truth about him. He had been sealed to something like 30 to 40 women while publicly denying the practice existed. 4 months before he died, he had been anointed king over Israel in a private council while running for president of the United States. And in the final 10 minutes of his life, he did not die on his knees. He died returning fire with a smuggled pistol and wounding men in a stairwell. A martyr, on the old definition, is someone killed for refusing to renounce a faith. Joseph Smith was killed at the violent end of a political and legal fight that he had helped escalate at nearly every step. Calling that martyrdom is a category error, and the Church's own scripture makes it worse by putting him second only to Jesus in what he did for the salvation of the world. That is the case. It is not fringe, it is not stupid, and if you cannot say it out loud, you do not understand your own history well enough to be trusted with it. Here is my honest answer, in 3 parts, and it is not a bow on top. First, on the pistol. The faithful discomfort with that pepper box has always struck me as backwards. If your definition of a martyr requires the man to be passive while his brother is shot dead in front of him and 2 more men are bleeding on the floor, your definition is about aesthetics, not about faith. What the pistol actually shows is that he was a human being in a room with his family being killed. It makes the scene worse, not cleaner. And it is in the Church's own accounts. John Taylor described it in the account that became section 135 of the Doctrine and Covenants. It was never hidden. It got sanded off in Sunday retellings, which is a different problem, and it is tonight's problem, and I'll get there. Second, on the word martyr. The strict definition doesn't fit cleanly, and I'd rather concede that than argue it. But look at the actual mechanism of the death. A group of men blacked their faces and shot 2 unarmed prisoners in state custody under a governor's written pledge of protection, and the reason they did it was religious. Thomas Sharp had been printing anti-Mormon material for 3 years before there was any press to destroy. Whatever legal fight Joseph Smith had picked, the men on the stairs were not there over a nuisance abatement ruling. They were there because of what these people believed and how many of them there were. You can decline the word martyr and still say plainly that this was a religious lynching that a county arranged and a jury excused. Third, and this is where I stop short of comfort, the case against him and the fact of his murder are both true at the same time, and neither cancels the other. A man can overreach, conceal, escalate, and be genuinely dangerous to the civil order around him, and still be shot to death without trial by men who were never punished for it. History does that constantly. It is only religious storytelling that insists a person must be all one thing. After 5 parts, I've stopped needing him to be simple, and I think that's the only honest place to land. Now the part that matters most and gets the least screen time. What happens to a church built entirely around one man the morning after that man is gone? It very nearly did not survive. Understand the structure. Everything ran through Joseph Smith. The revelations, the translations, the property, the temple, the city, the militia. There was no succession procedure written anywhere that everyone agreed on, and most of the quorum of the 12 were not even in Illinois in June of 1844. They were out east, campaigning for his presidential run. They found out from newspapers. Sidney Rigdon got back first. Rigdon had been Joseph's first counselor for years, though they had fallen out badly, and he arrived from Pittsburgh in early August, claiming that he had received a vision and should be made guardian of the church. Brigham Young and most of the 12 got back on the 6th of August, and on the 8th of August, 1844, in a grove in Nauvoo, several thousand people met to decide who they were going to follow. Rigdon spoke first, for a long time, in the morning. Brigham Young spoke in the afternoon, and his argument was structural rather than mystical. He said that the quorum of the 12 apostles held the keys, that Joseph had given them everything before he died, and that no man could replace him as the prophet of this dispensation. The congregation voted to sustain the 12. Now there is a famous story attached to that afternoon. Many people later said that when Brigham Young stood to speak, he looked and sounded like Joseph Smith. The voice, the build, the mannerisms. It is called the Transfiguration, and it is told in this church constantly. I'll tell you what the record actually shows, because I would rather you hear it from me than from someone using it against you. There are well over 100 accounts of that phenomenon, and they are real accounts from real people, but almost all of them were written down years and often decades later. The contemporary minutes and the journals kept that same week do not mention it. Historians who have studied the collection, including Latter-day Saint historians publishing in church-adjacent journals, generally conclude something happened in that grove that many people experienced as overwhelming, and that the specific transfiguration language grew and standardized in the retelling over the following decades. That is not a debunking. Memory does that with every enormous event, religious or not. But if you have been told that 100 contemporaneous witnesses saw Joseph Smith's face on Brigham Young that day, you have been told something the sources don't quite support. And you deserve to know it from a friendly voice first. The vote in the Grove settled the majority. It did not settle everyone. James Strang, a recent convert in Wisconsin, produced a letter he said Joseph had written him 9 days before the killing, appointing him successor. Strang gathered a real following, moved them to Beaver Island in Lake Michigan, had himself literally crowned king in 1850, and was assassinated by his own people in 1856. Lyman White took a group to Texas. Alpheus Cutler took another. A small group went back to Independence, Missouri, and bought the Temple lot, and they still own it. And Emma Smith stayed in Nauvoo. She never went west. And I've told you she gets her own episode on this channel, and she does. In 1860, her son, Joseph Smith III, accepted the leadership of what became the reorganized church, and Emma joined it. And that church still exists today under the name Community of Christ. So the two largest branches of this history are, at the root, a disagreement between Joseph Smith's wife and Joseph Smith's apostles about what he actually wanted. And here is the fact that answers the question everyone asks about the killing, which is whether it worked. It worked completely. If the point of the 27th of June was to break the political power of that city, the men in the stairwell got exactly what they wanted, and they got it fast. On the 29th of January, 1845, the Illinois legislature repealed the Nauvoo Charter. In one vote, the city lost its court, its militia, its university, and its right to govern itself. 12,000 people were now living in a settlement with no legal existence, in a county that had just acquitted 5 men of murdering their leader. Then came September of 1845. And this is the part almost nobody outside this history has heard of. Mobs began systematically burning outlying Latter-day Saint farms and homes south of Nauvoo, around the Morley settlement, working through the countryside for the better part of 2 weeks. Something on the order of 200 buildings went up. Houses, barns, the year's harvest in the barns. Families walked into Nauvoo carrying what they could hold. And that autumn, the leaders of the church signed an agreement to leave the state in the spring. They did not get the spring. The first wagons crossed the Mississippi on the 4th of February, 1846, into an Iowa winter, and the river froze hard enough that later companies drove teams across the ice. The ones who could not travel, the sick and the poor and the ones with nobody left, stayed behind through the summer. In September of 1846, a militia force shelled Nauvoo for several days in what is genuinely called the Battle of Nauvoo, and the last of them were driven across the river and left camped on the Iowa Flats with almost no food. So when you hear the word martyrdom applied to the 27th of June, hold this next to it. What followed was not martyrdom in any poetic sense. It was 2 years of arson, legal dismantlement, and finally artillery aimed at a civilian population in the United States, and no one was ever punished for any of it either. The saints in Nauvoo finished the temple anyway. That's the detail I find hardest to explain and easiest to admire. Knowing they were leaving under a repealed charter, with the smoke from the Morley settlement still on the horizon, they kept working on that building, and in December of 1845, they began giving endowments in the attic story and ran them day and night, thousands of people through that room in a matter of weeks, because they knew they would not have another building for years, and some of them would not live to see one. They dedicated it in the spring, after most of them had already gone, and then walked away from it. It burned in 1848, and a tornado took most of what was standing in 1850. They went west with Brigham Young, and that is the beginning of a different series. So here's the villain of this whole 5-part run, and it was never the mob. It is the reduction. The habit on all sides of taking a life this complicated and collapsing it into one verdict, usually the verdict you had before you started. The faithful version reduces him to the boy in the grove and the man in the jail, and quietly loses the mayor who destroyed a newspaper and the man who was sealed to other men's wives. The critical version reduces him to the ceilings and the bank and the expositor, and loses the 12,000 people who followed him to a swamp and drained it, and the Liverpool spinner who crossed an ocean because of what he'd been told about his dead mother. And the true crime version, which is the newest one and the one I like least, reduces the whole thing to an American murder mystery with a body at the end, because a body at the end is what gets clicks. All three of those are the same failure wearing different clothes. They take a man who was born in 1805 in Vermont and died at 38 in an Illinois jail, and who in between founded cities, dictated scripture, ran for president, made real enemies for real reasons, and inspired a devotion that has outlived him by nearly 2 centuries. And they flatten him to fit in a thumbnail. I have spent 5 parts refusing to do that, and it cost me the clean version every time. There is no episode in this run where I got to end with everything tucked in. Here's what I think you actually get from 5 parts of primary documents. Not a verdict. A person. Someone whose worst pages are worse than a believer wants, and whose best pages are more remarkable than a critic will allow. If your faith needed him to be spotless, this series has been hard on you, and I'm sorry. And I'd also gently say that a faith that needs a spotless founder is a faith with a bomb in the basement. Because the documents are online now, and they are free, and they are not going away. And if you came in certain he was a fraud, the honest problem you're left with is that the fraud theory has to explain the people. Not the plates, the people. The thousands who knew him personally, who watched him fail publicly, who buried children on the trail after he died, and who went anyway. The church he left published the Joseph Smith papers, footnotes and all. Anyone can read them. That decision, more than anything said from a pulpit, is why I think this history can be told straight now. It is the reason this channel can exist, which is the whole reason I ask the question I ask. And this one I've been saving for the end of the series. So give me a real answer. After 5 parts, what surprised you most about the man behind the story? Not the thing that confirmed what you already thought, the thing you did not see coming, the thing you had to go look up because you didn't believe me. Put it in the comments. Somebody is going to scroll past your answer tonight at 2 in the morning while they're sitting with a page of this history that scared them, and yours might be the one that helps. I'm Nathan Reeves. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.